Morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to see a good turnout on a Sunday morning and also on a day that the cricket match is underway. So thank you for being here. I'm just curious, how many of you are here at BIC for the first time? Ram, that makes about 20 people. So thank you so much for, like the Pied Piper, drawing in more people into BIC. So for these 20, there's a standard pitch that I say every time for the newcomers. So Bangalore International Center is a privately enabled public purpose place. It's a place for informed conversation, arts and culture. We do about 300 odd events per year across conversations, arts and culture. All BIC events are free to attend. So you don't need to be a member to be here. The whole idea really is to expose people. Bangalore, anybody from Bangalore is welcome. And to follow us, you can follow us on social media. Instagram is the most popular handle. You can also sign up for mailers on our BIC website. And since I have your attention, next weekend, we have a BIC Habba on 25th and 26th, which across the entire building, it will showcase all the various things that BIC does, from performances to policy discussions to stories about Bangalore and the like. Moving on, today we are very happy to have the third edition of India After Gandhi happen here. The first happened in 2007, and we are all breaking our head to figure out in which hotel it happened. The second edition event happened at Alliance Francaise. I see Manish Sabarwal here. He was in conversation with Ram Guha. And we at BIC said this cannot happen anymore. We have to build an auditorium and a building so that Ram can do his future events out here. So we're very glad that we have a building in place, and Ram's third edition of India After Gandhi is happening out here. Thank you, Ram, for doing this. I now call Ram's editor and publisher, Teesta Guha Sarkar, Pan Macmillan, and she will walk you through the journey which has brought this book to where it is today. Teesta.
Thank you, Ravi. Good morning, everyone. And thank you for joining us on this crisp Sunday morning to mark the publication of the third edition of Ramachandra Guha's definitive history of our nation. Like Ravi said, it is my great pleasure to take you through the journey that the book has been on these last 15 years. India After Gandhi was first published in 2007, 10 years after Peter Strauss, who was then at the helm of Picador, asked an unsuspecting Ram Guha to write a history of independent India. To quote Ram, he then considered himself principally an academic historian who wrote for his peers and for university students. But the idea's appeal soon took hold, and after years of primary research, filled up notebooks and eventually a whole study, the first draft of what would become India After Gandhi was born. The chapters were first collected in a folder titled Mythical History Book, as Ram tells us in his preface to the second edition, and finally submitted as History Book Revised. Since the days of its research to soon being hailed as a modern classic, to its third and latest edition, both the book and its protagonist have experienced an eventful journey. In the decade after the book's first publication, India witnessed two general elections, the fall of the Congress and the rise of Narendra Modi, a major anti-corruption movement, among many other transformative events. The 10th anniversary edition, which was published in 2017, took stock of all this and more. The newly launched third edition comes only 5 years after the last one, for reasons Ram has described in a new preface. It has partly to do with the dramatic events and transformations India has seen in this short span of time, from demonetization to a devastating pandemic, Narendra Modi's re-election as Prime Minister, the abrogation of Kashmir's autonomous status, large-scale citizens' protests, and unprecedented state crackdown on dissent. Events that are so radical that they prompted noteworthy updates to the book's closing, as captured in a new epilogue, and as some among you might have already noticed, on the new cover of the book itself. With the addition of this new material, namely a long chapter and that epilogue, India After Gandhi becomes more complete, urgent, and essential as ever. As Ram's publishers, we are really proud to be associated with this tremendous book that has contributed and continues to contribute to the historiography of our nation. At the same time, it must be remembered that the challenges confronting a historian and a scholar of contemporary history are many. And as Ram reminds us, historians of India traditionally have only looked at events before 15th August 1947, treating that date as a sort of boundary that one must not cross. Today, he will therefore narrate his own experiences in breaching this taboo by speaking of the primary sources, the methods, and the processes that are available to scholars and writers of contemporary history, and the biases that they must be aware of. Ram, could I invite you to deliver your talk?
Thank you, Ravi. Thank you, Tista. I'm delighted to be at the Bangalore International Center speaking about what is the third and most likely the last edition of India After Gandhi. I have a complicated relationship with this city. I consider it my hometown, though many residents would not allow me that claim. I actually have two hometowns, the one where I was born and raised, Dehradun, and the other to which I came every year for a holiday from the time I was a little boy, and where I have lived with my wife Sujata and our children for the last 30 years. I am a resident, I should be particular, because historians should be specific, of Cantonment, Bangalore. So, of course, there's a historic division between the city and the cantonment, and this division is geographical, aesthetic, architectural, linguistic, culinary, and so on, musical, and so on and so forth, both very different and very each equally rich and diverse parts of the city. Now, of course, there's a third and a fourth and a fifth and a sixth and a seventh Bangalore, which I shall not talk about. But as someone who claims Bangalore, and particularly Bangalore Cantonment, as his hometown, I'd like to say that the Bangalore International Center is now one of my 5 favorite places in Cantonment, Bangalore. The others are jostling for first place. It's a close contest between Kaman Park and Koshi's Parades Cafe. A lot depends on the time of the day. So before 8 o'clock, it is Kaman Park. After 9:30, it is certainly Koshi's Parades Cafe. 3, 4, and 5, and I won't rank them, are occupied by the Bangalore International Center and 2 wonderful, distinct bookstores on Church Street, Blossom and Bookworm. So I'm really happy and delighted to be here at the BIC, which is a splendid organization rendering a great public service to all the citizens of all the Bangalores, not just Cantonment and City, but Whitefield and Koramangala and Electronic City and Jakasandra and God knows Yamalur and God knows what else, right? Now, so, as I said, this is probably the last edition. So let me begin with how I wrote this book. The journey has been a quarter of a century in the making. And it was in, shall we say, this entire enterprise, which is, I don't have a copy here now with me, which is now close to 1,000 pages. This entire enterprise was in defiance of a lakshman rekha that defined the Indian historical profession. And that lakshman rekha was midnight on 14th, 15th August 1947, where, according to the Indian historical profession, history ended and political science began. And this kind of very rigorous definition of where history ended dominated history writing when I was growing up. I was born in the late 50s. I went to university in the 70s. I did my PhD in the 80s. I wrote my first book in 1989. And at this stage, history was flourishing as a subject of teaching and research. And contrary to what you may hear nowadays, it was not just taught at JNU, and it was not just practiced by Marxists. So it was a very rich and diverse field. There were people in many different university departments doing economic history, cultural history, intellectual history, social history, gender history. As this system flourished, the system of historical research flourished under the aegis of the Indian universities that grew in the 50s and 60s and 70s with many world-class scholars, practicing and teaching history and guiding doctoral students. This Lakshman Rekha continued to be sacrosanct. So you had a very broad tripartite chronological classification, which all of you are aware of, whether you've studied history or not, between ancient, medieval, and modern history. So there were debates as to when ancient history gave way to medieval, and certainly very intense debates when I was starting out as to the blurring of the boundaries between the medieval and the modern. So one of the more interesting ideas that comes up when I'm starting my journey as a scholar is the idea of the early modern, the late 17th, early 18th centuries, which is a kind of a transition. So there's no, the boundary between ancient and medieval and modern is blurred. It's overlapping. It's defined differently depending on what part of India you're dealing with. It's defined differently depending on what is your subject of research. Whether it's technology or architecture or clothing or economic life or crops grown or urban settlement. When does ancient become medieval and when does medieval become modern? There are lots of debates about this. But there's absolutely no debate about when the modern period ends. Indeed, when history ends, which is, as I said, when the clock struck midnight on 15th August, 1947. Now, this was a completely legitimate position to take in the 1950s. Also possibly in the 1960s. But as you reach the 1970s and the 1980s, and independence is 3 or 4 decades in the past, surely it is time to consider the 1950s history too. In the 1980s, 25 years after Jawaharlal Nehru had died, why weren't historians writing about the making of the republic, of the formation of the electoral system, about the conflicts over linguistic states, or about the origins of the planning process and the debates around it? But no, they were not. History was still something that ended in 1947, and civics and political science and anthropology was what you did after that. And of course, the real growth area was the period of colonial rule. This epic contest between British colonialism and Indian nationalism. And of course, you interpreted it and passed it in different ways. Some gave the Congress an elevated place in that battle. Others looked at other grassroots movements of tribals and peasants. If you're looking from the perspective of the imperial state, some radical critiques of economic exploitation under the Raj. Others would talk about what the Raj indirectly brought us in terms of access to new technology, awareness of the infirmities in our own society, which led to the birth of our social reform movements and so on. But all these studies, and there were hundreds of them, they were the 70s and 80s saw some really world-class Indian historians emerging. A large number worked on the colonial period. And no one at all looked at what was happening after 1947 and instructed their doctoral students likewise. Now, the Indian situation in this regard is or was very different from what was happening in other parts of the world. So, obviously, 15th August 1947 is a major landmark. It's a major and definitive break in the history of our country because the British leave and we have become independent and we are also divided. And of course, a few months later, Gandhi dies. So you can see this as marking a major break in our understanding of our past. Now, a similar break when it comes to Europe is the end of the Second World War. And with America too. 1945, between 1939 and 1945, you have this most brutal and bloody armed conflict when nuclear weapons are used for the first time, a battle against certainly the most murderous modern tyrant, And then it ends, and of course, virtually every British, French, German family has some stake in the war, as someone who served or was killed. Many Americans likewise, Australians, New Zealanders. And then you have, after the war ending, you have, of course, America and Russia, who were allies in the war, becoming rivals, and the Cold War starting. So 1945 is a very major kind of break, you could say a historical break in the history of Europe and North America. And recognizing that after 1945, the history of Europe and North America changed radically and definitively, and a new world was born with very different political, cultural, economic, technological, military configurations. When these countries came to the 1970s, historians started looking at the 1940s and 1950s. And when they came to the 1980s, they started looking at the 1950s. Because essentially, you need about a generation's distance to write about the past, with some amount of detachment, objectivity, and access to primary sources. It's no accident that most governments, not ours, opens records after 30 years. Ours does it never, if they at all keep them. So you could see that what was happening in France and Germany and England and so on, and America was, by the time you read the 1970s, historians are writing about the origins of the Cold War. By the time you read the 1980s, historians are writing about Vietnam. By the time you read the 1990s, they're writing about the counter-cultural movement, the growth of Western environmentalism and the publication of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, the growth of a feminist movement and the major feminist writings of that time and the activism they engendered in the 60s and 70s. But none of this was affecting us, which, again, I'd like to underline, was not terra luna as far as historical research went. In fact, these very decades, the 80s, which saw the flourishing of post-war history in Europe and North America, that's the decade in which subaltern studies, a very influential movement of historians, is born in India. It's the decade in which the first environmental history is written, the most feminist histories are written, and so on and so forth, but all about the colonial period or before. So it's in this context, what I may call the near total neglect by Indian historians of post-independence history. There were a few exceptions. So if I was to, 25 years ago, if I was asked to count well-researched, closely argued, and relatively non-partisan works of history by Indians or foreigners on the post-47 period, there would be these books could be counted on the fingers of one hand, possibly two. So there would be S. Gopal's biography of S. Gopal's biography of Nehru, the second and third volume. There would be Rajmohan Gandhi's biographies of Patel and Rajaji. There would be a couple of very good books on the partition in Bengal, another couple of decent books on the partition in Punjab. But of course, the partition is still the unfinished business of colonialism. And that's about it. Now, in this kind of context, I got a phone call in Bangalore from a gentleman I had never heard of called Rajdeep Mukherjee. And he said that Picador, which was a well-established British literary imprint, was starting an Indian outfit. And the person running Picador was very keen to meet me. This was in, I said in 1997, late 1997, when India had just celebrated 50 years of independence. And he named, I had never heard of Rajdeep Mukherjee, which was not surprising because he was then a very young man entering publishing. What was more surprising and more revealing of the kind of person I then was that I'd not heard of the head of Picador who was coming. His name was Peter Strauss, and he was coming to start the Indian branch and said, Rajdeep Mukherjee, he wants to meet you. Later on, I found out that he was actually a very important publisher who had published V.S. Naipaul and Graham Robb and Julian Barnes and many other people, but I had no clue about him because the kind of books I wrote were not of, those that were usually found in, in general interest stores. So it turned out that I was in Delhi when Peter Strauss was coming, so we met. And we met in the lovely atrium of the Imperial Hotel. And he was carrying a copy of an Oxford journal called Past and Present, which is a scholarly historical journal, certainly my favorite historical journal, which is the reason I had sent them an article called Cricket and Politics in Colonial India, which they had published. And Mr. Strauss introduced himself and said, thank you for agreeing to meet me, and held up Past and Present, which kind of puzzled me, because I was surprised to see a trade publisher reading a scholarly history journal. And he said, I just read this. What are you doing next? So I said, well, I'm actually, I said, I'm actually expanding this essay into a book, which was my plan. I'm writing a socialist certificate. He said, no, don't do that. Write a history of independent India. Now, I was struck speechless. As some of you know, it takes a lot to strike me speechless. I said, ये क्या बकवास है, ये क्या बक रहा है? History of independent India? The whole of India from the beginning? What the hell does this man think? He said, wait a minute. He said, is it true that you've just celebrated your 50th anniversary? I said, yes. Is it true that you're a very large and diverse country? I said, yes. Is it true that it is something of a miracle that you've remained largely united and mostly democratic since 1947? I said, yes. Is it true that India is experiencing an economic surge since liberalization? I said, yes. Then he said, don't you think this experiment deserves its history? And I said, let me think about it. And he said, okay, I'll give you 6 weeks, and I'll call you after 6 weeks. And I went back, came back home, and I thought about all these posers. Isn't 50 years long enough to understand the origins and evolution of this country? Isn't the experiment quite extraordinary? Isn't the country itself one of the most diverse and complicated in the world? Surely it deserves a critical look by a historian. Isn't that divide between where that lakshman rekha artificial, unjustified, illogical, bizarre? Shouldn't someone, maybe me, try to breach it? So I was thinking through all these things, and then Peter Strauss calls me and says, what do you think? I said, it's an interesting idea. We talked a little more about it. And he said, okay, I'll give you a contract. And the contract arrived. It was signed in March 1998, and the book was due in May 2002. And the title, the working title at that time was A Functioning Anarchy, which was borrowed from a phrase that the American economist John Kenneth Galbraith used to describe India. Galbraith was President Kennedy's ambassador to this country in the early 60s. So this is the phrase he used, a functioning anarchy. So it was called A Functioning Anarchy, A History of Modern India was the working title. And I set to work. Now, excuse me, when 25 years ago, Peter Strauss asked me to write this book. In retrospect, when I look at the commission and my accepting it, I had several advantages to approach a task of this kind, mammoth and complicated though it might have been. I believe I had several advantages. One, I had enough experience in breaking that Lakshman Rekha, because actually I was trained in sociology. My own intellectual trajectory is that I did 2 degrees in economics and a PhD in sociology. And my doctoral research was on the celebrated Chipko movement, was supposed to be on the celebrated Chipko movement, the peasant protest movement of the 1970s against commercial logging in the Himalaya. And by researching it, by accident, I found a long train of protests against state forest usurpation going back to the 19th century. So my first book, The Unquiet Woods, starts then. It starts in the 1880s and comes down to the Chipko activism of the 1970s and 80s. So from my first piece of research, I disregarded this Lakshman rekha. Actually, and I was, when I started working in the archives, it was my advisors, who were sociologists, who said, don't go to the archives. Sociologists do field work, historians go to the archives. So kind of every discipline has its methodological fetish, its prejudice. ये हम नहीं करते हैं, वो और लोग करते हैं. Other people, historians would say, other people look at what happens after 1947, and sociologists would say, we don't go to the archives, we only go to the field. Right. Now, I had already started breaching these disciplinary and methodological divides. I'd then written a book on the anthropologist very relevant, which also, he was born in 1902 and it comes down to his death in 1964. So that was one advantage I felt I had, that I didn't really care about what history was supposed to be and what sociology was supposed to be, at least from a chronological point of view. Secondly, I was not a narrow specialist. I had written social histories, environmental histories, biographies, and also on cricket. So, I had been writing different kinds of things, and to attempt an exercise of this scope, macro history of all of India, allegedly in all its different dimensions, I was, I had been kind of reckless enough in the past to think I could try it. Thirdly, I think the third advantage I had was that I was already writing for a general audience. Obviously I paid my dues in the archives. I love doing primary research, and I still do. But I understood that history was a branch of social science as well as a branch of literature. Now, this is not something many historians understand. They think it's a branch of social science. They like to use jargon in their prose. They crave, above all, the approval of their peers in the academy. And at this stage, to explain this kind of a limitation of a certain kind of historian, not all historians, let me relate anecdotally the most curious compliment I've ever got, which was in the year 1995. I'd written an essay in the Economic and Political Weekly criticizing subaltern studies for its navel gazing, for its descent into what I call Bhadralok studies. Here were Bengalis writing about other Bengalis, middle-class Bengali males writing about other middle-class Bengali males. So I wrote this critique, and shortly after I published it, in the library of the Nehru Memorial Museum in Delhi, I ran across a professor at JNU who said, Ram, I liked your article. I recommended it to my students to read. And I told them, don't be taken in by how well it is written. It is still saying important things. And that remains the most curious and, in some ways, the most cherished compliment I've ever got. Which tells you something about academic prose, not just in history, but in sociology, in anthropology, and above all in literary studies. So I enjoyed writing for a wider audience. The historians I admired were not stuffy, jargon-wielding pen pushers, but they were people like E.P. Thompson and Linda Colley and Mark Bloch, people who did fabulous research, had a keen analytical mind, but wrote a really eloquent, stylish prose. So that's, I think, the third advantage I had. And the fourth advantage, again, this is all in retrospect, was that I was exactly the right age. I was commissioned to write the book when I was 40. It was submitted when I was almost 50, so it took twice as long to research and write as promised. But if I'd been 30 when I was commissioned to write the book, I'd have been too callow and too inexperienced. And if I had been 50, I'd have been too tired. So I don't think Peter Strauss knew that when he commissioned me. He just saw, I am starting a branch of picador in India. India needs a contemporary modern history. I've just come across this guy who's written this kind of interesting essay on cricket and politics and the politics of caste to the cricket field. And maybe he's the guy. And he may have expected to meet a 70-year-old man or a 25-year-old woman. I don't know what he had in mind. But in retrospect, I think I was just the right age. So I had these several advantages. But set against these advantages, there were some major challenges and hurdles that confronted me. And I'll mention two in particular. One is the sheer scale and scope of the exercise. And let me tell again a story to illustrate why it was such a daunting exercise. Now, what if someone had, if I was Norwegian, and if a Norwegian publisher had asked me in the year 1997 to write a history of Norway from the end of the Second World War, it would be relatively easy, a small country, mostly along the coast, a little bit of mountain, a population of about 8-10 million, all speaking the same language, a few tribals here and there, and so on and so forth. हो जाएगा, मुमकिन है. मोदी भी नहीं है, तब भी मुमकिन है. Right. So I could have done it, but here you are, whole of India, 1947 onwards. Everything, how, sorry, I can't use an expletive at the moment, but I want to. How the ... was I going to do this? So that was the first thing, it was really, I was gripped, and that's one reason it took so long. I actually never thought I would do it. For a long time, the notes I gathered for this book, which I will come to in a minute, were in a folder called Mythical History Book, because I actually thought I would never be able to do it. So that was the first challenge. And the second challenge, so the first challenge was conceptual. The second challenge was methodological, namely, where the hell were the sources? The British state in India maintained a very meticulous archive, which was intact when they left in 1947. So I had worked, for example, in several state archives, in Lucknow, the UP State Archives, in Mumbai, the Maharashtra State Archives, in Chennai, the Tamil Nadu State Archives, and in the National Archives. And I knew how rich and how voluminous the state records were on forests, agriculture, industry, commerce, migration, demography, health, education. It was anyone writing on the 19th or early 20th century had a very capacious state archive to use. But where were the state papers after 1947? They didn't exist. They hadn't been transferred. So I had to look for different kinds of sources than were conventionally available. Not only were the state archives invisible or more or less blank. So, for example, if only now some of them have become available, long after I finished this book, partly because for the first time in recorded history, Dr. Balmun Singh appointed a historian as the Director General of the National Archives. Before him and after him, there have only been IAS officers who hold the post along with other posts and like it because it's a larger office than their other offices and comes with an additional car. But Dr. Balmun Singh, possibly being a scholar himself, and possibly because his daughter is a great historian, Upinder Singh, albeit of ancient India, appointed Professor Mushirul Hasan, one of our finest historians of colonial India, as the director of the National Archives between 2005 and 2008 or 9. And that was in retrospect a golden age, because Mushir, which I had taken the liberty of calling him, he's now no longer with us, was an old and close friend, went from ministry to ministry and went to the Home Ministry and said, transfer the records on the integration of the states. Went to the Education Ministry and said, transfer the records on the University Grants Commission. And he got all these papers, which are now there in the National Archives, but they weren't there for me. I'm glad they're there for younger scholars because of that happy and never to be repeated accident, that a historian was in charge of the National Archives. A trained historian was in charge of the National Archives. So the state archives are not there. The papers of our two longest serving prime ministers, Jawaharlal Nehru and Indira Gandhi, had been close to scholars by Sonia Gandhi, who was fearful about what might we discover, which would hurt the chances of her son Rahul Gandhi in politics. So this was the kind of hurdle we faced, right? I faced. I realized that there were ways of overcoming it. One way of overcoming it was that you could use the fabulous private paper collection of the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, which is a great public institution. Again, became great because it was run by professional historians. It's now again run by for the last 8 or 9 years, it's been run by IAS officers, and less said about what they're doing to it is the better. But when it was run by B.R. Nanda and Professor Ravindra Kumar, they collected the private papers of 500 remarkable Indians. Nehru's and Indira's were closed because of the family, but the papers of other remarkable Indians, such as Chakravarti Rajagopalachari, socialist leaders like George Fernandez, the papers of the Communist Party, the papers of the Jan Sangh, the papers of P.N. Haksar, who was Indira Gandhi's closest advisor, were all open. So I realized that I know many diplomats, it has the papers of many, many diplomats. So if you want to study the China crisis, you can actually look at the papers of diplomats. So I spent, in the course of research for this book, I spent months and months working, going from Bangalore, 3 weeks at a time, and studying the fabulously rich private paper collection of the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, where by studying the papers of diplomats, bureaucrats, ministers, opposition politicians, judges, scientists, I was able to get deep insights into public policy and how it was formulated. Then there were papers in British archives, which was actually quite interesting, because many British colonial officials who had served in India retained a deep interest in the districts they had worked in. I'll just give you 2 examples. There's a very great British, a couple who are very fine art historians. Some of you may know their names, Mildred and W.G. Archer, who basically curated the great Indian art collection of the Victoria and Albert Museum. W.G. Archer was an ICS officer who served in Chota Nagpur in the 1930s and 40s, the crucial Adivasi belt of Jharkhand. And he and Mildred kept, in their papers, they retained clippings of what was going on in Jharkhand in the 50s and 60s. They corresponded with people. So he was one, W.G. Archer and his wife Mildred. Another very interesting ICS officer was a man called Posse, Charles Posse, who was the last deputy commissioner in the Naga Hills in 1947. And again, had a deep and abiding interest in the Naga question. And his papers, which are in Cambridge, the Archer papers are in London, contain rich details of the Naga insurgency in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. So I was able to go there, look at these British administrators and sometimes journalists and the papers they kept. Then I had, the rich vein of Indian newspapers and magazines to treat as a primary source. So for example, when I wrote about the 1952 elections, the first elections, which is the subject of a chapter in my book, one of the chapters that I most enjoyed writing, where there was a great diversity of parties and leaders, many remarkable leaders who did propaganda for their parties in that election. And the first time Indians were voting, that was called the biggest gamble in history, that election. Because never before in human history had a population that was largely illiterate been given the vote regardless of caste and gender. Women were voting in Indian elections 2 decades before they were voting in Swiss elections. So I wanted to tell the story of these 52 elections, and the papers of the Election Commission were not available. So I went to the newspapers. And I looked at one newspaper for every major region. So I looked at the Searchlight for Eastern India, Hindustan Times for Northern India, Times of India for Western India, and the Hindu for Southern India. I looked at day by day the reports of what was happening, who was voting, how was the elections conducted, what were the campaign speeches about, what was Nehru saying, what were Nehru's critics saying, what were the skeptical noises in the foreign press about whether this would succeed. So the newspaper and journal archives were indispensable for my research. So you had the private paper collections of the Nehru Museum, the records of British colonial officials who retained a deep interest in independent India, microfilm records of newspapers and magazines. Here again, it helped that I was in my 40s. Today, I can't be reading those microfilms, hour by hour and by hour. Mere bas ki nahi hai, it'd be beyond me. Then you had government reports and documents, including the Lok Sabha debates, which were very rich at that time. And finally, a very important secondary source, which became a primary source for me, was scholarly works by anthropologists, political scientists, and economists. So, through the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, you had anthropologists, both Indian and foreign, studying the operations of caste and gender in different villages. So what was the position of Dalits in northern India in the 1950s? You'd have an anthropological study. How did the Tamil language movement emerge in Tamil Nadu in the 1960s? You'd have a Western anthropologist, Indian anthropologist doing fieldwork in 1965 studying it and writing about it. Or of the behavior of political parties. What was the internal organization of the Congress party like in 1967? Was the subject of a very good book by an outstanding political scientist called Myron Weiner. So all these works became primary sources. And I was able to access them, even though I live in Bangalore with no access to a library, because of Select Bookshop, which is not one of the two bookshops I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. Mr. Murthy, who's now in his 90s and not very active anymore, sourced many books for me. And so did another very fine used bookstore, Prabhu Book Service in Gurgaon. So these are the kinds of multiple sources I used to research my book. And doing research is terribly exciting. To go into an archive, find a letter, transcribe it, look at a newspaper report and see what it is saying, find some hidden gem on page 223 of a ponderously written scholarly tome on caste in Kerala. It's incredibly exciting. And in those days, I used to take notes by hand. And I actually don't like Xeroxing, because scholars with large research budgets go to a library, photocopy 10,000 pages, take it back home, and maybe never look at it again. And I actually like taking notes. And I have in my cupboard in my study about 120 notebooks full of these notes, which only I can read. So the research was incredibly interesting. But at some stage, I had to stop and begin writing. To assimilate what one has found and to give it a concrete shape. And this was the third, in some ways, greatest challenge for me while writing this book. How was I going to structure it? What were the themes I was going to highlight? How were those themes going to feed into each other? How was a thematic approach going to blend with a chronological framework? This was not a sociological study. I had to somehow trace the evolution of this complicated and tortuous political and social experiment. And I think the conceptual challenge of designing each chapter and the sections of each chapter was, I think, the most difficult and complex intellectual challenge I faced. I followed India after Gandhi with a 2-volume biography of Gandhi. Now, obviously, that required even more research. I consulted some 80 archives in the course of that work. And Gandhi is a, protean, complex, endlessly intriguing and fascinating and controversial figure. But in terms of the narrative challenge, it's relatively easy because you follow his life, from month to month to month to month. But here, I think, how to break it all down. Eventually, I decided to have 5 parts, 47 to 52, 52 to 57, 57 to 64, 64 to 77, 77 to 89. And then there was a 6th part afterward. But that kind of became, and then in each it was thematic. So there were chapters, the part 1 has chapters on the making of the constitution, the resettlement of the refugees, the integration of princely states, the origins of the Kashmir crisis. So in each chronological section, there are different themes that emerged most visibly and starkly in that section. So part 2 has the linguistic stakes question, the rise of the Naga insurgency, tribal discontent. Part 3 has the China war. Part 4 is the emergency, and so on. Now, but actually designing the framework, the conceptual framework, what and how this would flow without necessarily skimping either on detail or on nuance or complexity. That was a great challenge. The challenge of structure and theme, what to include, what to leave out, what should be the organizing principles of each chapter. So each chapter had to first think of a section, what different chapters would go into it. Each chapter had to break into 8-9 parts, 8 or 9 distinct parts which would kind of feed into each other. And if there are any young writers in this room, let me offer you a tip. I've often asked, what are your tips for writing and so on. So there are really only 3. 1, devote a large chunk of time every day to writing, whether you're in the mood or not, whether your girlfriend has been kind to you or not. It could be 3 hours, 5 hours, it could be late night, early morning, doesn't matter. That's rule 1. I sit on my desk from 9:30 to 1:30, rule 1. Rule 2, do not have your mobile phone with you and disable FaceTime and WhatsApp from your computer. And rule 3, which is the one I have the most arguments with young writers about. When you finish your day's work, at whatever time of day it is, print out what you've written. I think seeing words on paper is a great aid for self-reflection and self-criticism, to see what's wrong. And then you print out 3 pages, the next day it's 6, and then it's 9. You see how page 8 relates or does not relate to page 1. What do you need to change? So that was the kind of writing challenge. And in all of this, I was guided by a maxim of the great Cambridge historian F.W. Maitland, who said, that which is now in the past was once in the future. That which is now in the past was once in the future. After writing this book, I gave many talks on subjects connected to the book. And in every audience, wherever I spoke about this book, anywhere in India, by the way, this was before the BJP came to power, so it's got nothing to do with the BJP. Everywhere I met people who could have been better prime ministers than Jawaharlal Nehru. They would have had a better economic policy, a social policy, handled Kashmir better, etc., etc., etc. And of course, that's because they're looking at it from 28 or 29 or 2012. And you have to look at 1947. What was the situation then? What did Nehru and Patel and Ambedkar and Gandhi know? Likewise in 1950, when the constitution was framed, or in 52, when the elections were held, or in 1959, where you have the first border conflict with China. This is a maxim which few historians today follow, but it's a very important cautionary maxim, particularly when writing contemporary history. Remember that which is now in the past was once in the future. Okay, now my work was animated by curiosity, by the desire to understand and not to judge. It was my own, one might say, discovery of India. I was born 10 years after independence, and I was discovering new things all the time. And that may be possibly why this book has endured and is being read, that I communicated some of my wonder and enchantment to the reader. The things that I was finding out and documenting and elaborating upon were new to the reader, but they had once been new to me, actually. Now, if I look back at this book, 15 years after it was written, and if I may allow myself some modest amount of self-congratulation, what am I most content about in writing this book, India After Gandhi, which has gone through multiple reprints, it's been translated in every major language, and I'm proud to announce it's soon to appear in Gujarati too. Last but not least, is to be appearing in Gujarati too. And whatever else I may write in the past or have written in before, it's obviously the book of mine that's going to have the most impact. Though it's not necessarily the favorite among all my books, which is a separate one. So what am I most happy about in writing this book? I think if I may just mention 4 things. First is that it drew on my training as a sociologist. That had been a sociologist before I became a historian meant I could write with some seriousness and hopefully some credibility about things like caste and gender and language and religion as axes of division. It was not simply chronological, it was also analytical. My book is not simply chronological, it's also analytical and sociological. So that's, I think, the first thing. And also I wrote quite a lot about popular social movements outside the party political framework. As someone who had cut his teeth as a student of the Chipko Andolan, I did not want to restrict my analysis of politics only to parties and elections. Second, I'm happy about the cast of secondary characters I brought to light. Of course, it's got a great deal about Nehru and Patel and Ambedkar and Jayaprakash Narayan and Atal Bihari Vajpayee. But people like Sukumar Sen, our first election commissioner, who is really one of the unsung heroes of Indian democracy, or Potti Sriramulu, the Gandhian from Andhra who went on fast and who redrew the map of India, or Angami Zapu Fizo, the radical leader from Nagaland. You know, these secondary, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, who played such a crucial role in resettling refugees and in nurturing our craft sector. So I think that bringing alive these secondary characters is something I greatly enjoy doing. The third aspect of the book I'm moderately pleased about, that it brings the Northeast into the discussion of the Indian Republic. Not wholly. In retrospect, I should have said more about Assam. But I think mine is the first general history of India to have a serious discussion of the Naga and the Mizo rebellions. And, you know, all of us are aware of the Kashmir dispute. We know that it originates really with partition, because Pakistan felt incomplete without Kashmir. India feels incomplete without Kashmir. We fought 4 wars and it's still unresolved. And there are all kinds of issues about how Pakistan has dealt with its part of Kashmir and we have dealt with our part of Kashmir. But actually, the Naga question predates the Kashmir question, because it was in 1946, a year before independence, that a group of Naga intellectuals set up the Naga National Council, saying that when the British leave, we will not join India, we will be independent. And that's the origin of a bruising dispute that is still unresolved. And the Mizo rebellion of 1960s, the first time the Indian Air Force was used on its own people was in 1965 in Azov. So it was a savage repression by the Indian state. However, it had a happy resolution, because in the 1980s, a pact signed when Rajiv Gandhi was Prime Minister brought the Mizos into the democratic mainstream. And unlike with Nagaland or with Kashmir, where we haven't really been able to achieve a successful and durable democratic resolution of the conflict, in Mizoram we have. So I'm glad I wrote about the Northeast. I wish I did a little more about Assam. And the last thing, I think, which gives me the most satisfaction is that one of the areas I had to venture in while writing this book was foreign policy. You know, as I said, I knew a fair amount about society and politics, but I really wasn't an international relations or foreign policy man, and I hadn't written about war before in anything I'd done. And I clearly had to deal with our disputes with Pakistan and our disputes with China. And I don't know whether it was a conscious decision or that's how it emerged, but I must say I'm very pleased that I wrote the chapters about our dispute and conflict with China and those regarding our dispute and conflict with Pakistan, not as an Indian, but as a historian. And I think, again, if I talked about peculiar compliments that satisfy me, when the book first came out, there was a long interview by a journalist about the book, and the magazine gave a rather sensationalist headline, as magazines are wont to do, and the headline said, Guha says, India's case on Kashmir is not constitutionally foolproof. And this was picked up by a Pakistani newspaper, which then gave it this twist in its report, claiming or saying, Indian historian says India has no case on Kashmir. I'd actually said Pakistan's case on Kashmir is also not constitutionally foolproof. In fact, if you look at why the Kashmir dispute is so deep and so enduring, it is because our case is less than robust and their case is less than robust. But both have a case. Likewise with China. If you look at the dispute with China, if you look at the eastern border in Arunachal, And if you try and look at it historically, China has strong claims on large parts of Arunachal, including the great sacred town of Tawang. But if you look at it in the west, in the Ladakh side, India's claims are much stronger on areas currently occupied by China in Aksai Chin. And when you have a dispute in two borders, in one case, the Indian case is stronger. In the other case, the Chinese case is stronger. But as it turned out, in the east, where the Chinese case is weaker, while the Chinese case is stronger, the interests are weaker. In the west, where the Indian case is stronger, the Chinese interest is stronger, because that's where they wanted a highway to build across Aksai Chin to link the two troublesome provinces of Xinjiang and Tibet. And that's the origin of the conflict. So I think in writing those chapters, I was very conscious. A historian, cannot wear his national identity on his sleeve. He, of course, should not wear his religious or caste or gender identity on his sleeve either. Now, but also in retrospect, I recognize some major weaknesses of the book. I've already briefly mentioned this whole question of Assam. But let me just say that in retrospect, I think two areas that India after Gandhi does not give enough attention to are economics and culture. And obviously, there's only so much you can do in a book, even a book that is 1,000 pages long. But I think the first one I regret more. Actually, the first edition had a chapter on film and culture, which I've dropped from subsequent editions because I had to add new material. But I think there's an urgent need for a really good economic history of independent India. Because I remember Ashok Desai, who's one of the finest Indian economists around, someone I greatly admire, reviewed my book, had nice things to say about it, but said, you can tell it's weak on economics by the fact that it has so few tables and so few numbers. And he was dead right. I'm a social and political historian, and that was my strength. Now, I just have a few remarks to make, and then I'd love for some questions from the audience. As Tista explained, a second edition came out in 2017, 10 years after the first. In that period, you'd had two general elections, the decline of the Congress and the rise of the BJP. You had a popular anti-corruption movement. You had the continuing crisis in Kashmir. And I felt all of this had to be covered in this second edition. Now, the third edition comes out not 10 years, but a mere 5.5 years after the second. And there are two reasons for this. So like the second edition, the third edition has one substantial new chapter of about 40 pages, incorporating what happened in the last 5 or 6 years. And I feel that what has happened is so dramatic and transformative and so portentous for our future as a republic and a democracy that I had to not wait 10 years, but do a third edition now. And so that new chapter, which is called Shock and Awe, talks about, of course, the 2019 election, the growth of a personality cult around our prime minister, the COVID pandemic, the economic disaster that was demonetization, the conflict with China, and so on and so forth. And then I've rewritten the epilogue too. I've rewritten the epilogue, and as Tista mentioned, also tweaked the subtitle a little bit, which I'll leave to your imagination. And that's what I've done in this last edition. And I say it may be the last edition, not because India won't change, not because new and exciting and complicated and great and horrible things will not happen in our country, and some historian will have to deal with them, but I'm now 65. And I wish things don't change so drastically that I have to do a fourth edition in 5 years. But surely in 5 or 10 years, some young and able historian will come and write a wholesale replacement for India after Gandhi from a very different perspective, using new ideas, new arguments, new sources, and so on. So, as I've said at the beginning of my talk, it's 25 years since India after Gandhi was commissioned. In that time, contemporary history, which was a blank slate when I began, has become an active, indeed thriving area of historical research. Scholars, Indian and foreign, have published excellent books on specific historical figures in post-independence India. There have been some wonderful biographies of politicians, writers, activists, scientists. Books on the new fine books on the history of constitutionalism, on the history of post-independence economic thought, on the history of Indian business, history of Indian film, history of Indian technology, caste, religion. Contemporary history is a thriving field. I said that when I began 25 years ago, if I was to list fine works of historical scholarship on post-independence India, there would be 5. Now there are at least 50 and counting. And that contemporary history is now a thriving rather than barren field, gives me special pleasure, and I'm glad to have played a small part in aiding this process along. Thank you.
Actually,
just one question, and it's a long line, so be quick.
Yeah. Okay. So there has always been a tendency to look in retrospective history and the works of figures selectively. Not just now, but has always been, okay. In your work as a historian, okay, as well as a sociologist, how can one's work, including your work, be protected from being used to push narratives? How do we counter the echo chamber and polarization that has emerged?
That's a separate debate. And I don't want to get into it. But again, I've given some words of advice to young scholars. Let me give a word to any young historian who wants to counter the narrative of so-called left-wing historians or pseudo-secularists or anything. History is about debate. History is an argument without end. So the more the books, the better you want. But the only piece of advice I would give is any scholar writing a book, once the book is published, do not have your picture taken with the Prime Minister or Home Minister. Let it stand on its own. That's all I'd say. Thank you.
If I can call you Ram, because we
Please.
first met 20 years ago at the launch of the Picador book of cricket, when I foolishly asked you which part of Bengal your ancestors came from. Since you've not revised parts of the book that are relatively old, I wanted to ask you about the Mandal ideas, whether you've revised your ideas since then. And I'm asking you this not as a historian, but as a public intellectual.
Thanks. That's a very good question. The reason I've not revised the earlier parts is let that be. Let young scholars come and contest what I say about the elections or Nehru or Indira Gandhi or the emergency. And, that's how history should progress. I've just added on. Now, with regard to Mandal, I think my own view, and I've tried to keep my political view out of it, is that I think any public institution can bear up to 1/3 reservation. Certainly we need affirmative action to take account of historic disadvantage of caste and gender and so on. And for that reason, a women's reservation bill would be a good idea. But once you reach 50%, and now it has become 60 and so on, then the whole autonomous functioning of the institution is affected. That's one point. The other point, I wish that even with Mandal or with reservation generally, a more rigorous creamy layer definition has been applied. Today you can be an IFS officer who got in through affirmative action, and your son or daughter will get in the same way. So these would be my 2 points.
Good afternoon, sir. So you wrote history, you wrote India after Gandhi at a time when the Indian state bore no malice against intellectuals. So my question is hypothetical. Let's say someone wants to write a new India after Modi. And the working title would be a dysfunctional oligarchy. So how will we go about, especially in a scenario wherein history is increasingly being replaced by mythology? In a more systematic manner.
Very good question. Can I modify the subtitle? A malfunctional oligarchy, with mal standing also for malice and malevolent and so on. All right. Now, it's a very good question. You're right. It's not as if there was no attacks on intellectuals. I'm well known as a critic of the dynastic culture of the Congress Party, but obviously there were less cost to that than being a critic of the personality cult of Narendra Modi and Hindutva bigotry of the BJP, which I also am, right? And, but, nothing is permanent. Things will change, things will emerge. There are still some safe spaces for people to write. I speak my mind freely, so do young writers. The same lessons I talked about would apply. Now, again, it would take a generation's distance. My chapters till 1990, I'd say in this book, till I'd say I've rewritten some of the later chapters also from the first edition, the first edition was 2007. So I'd say till about 2004, what I've written is history. From 2004, it's historically informed journalism. So if you read the epilogue, I have changed the epilogue. I have radically rewritten it. I've downgraded Indian democracy. And let me explain the subtitle. The original subtitle was India, a history of the world's largest democracy. It is now India, India after Gandhi, a history. And there may be, if the book is reprinted next year without changes to the text, there may be a change in the subtitle, which will become a history of the world's most populous nation. So, history of the world's largest democracy, even then, was probably a bit too hyperbolic. So there will be, but you need distance. So the impact of Jawaharlal Nehru on Indian public life is still being debated. And the last word has not been said, And the debate on Narendra Modi's impact on Indian public life has also begun. But you need 15 or 20 years to really critically assess it. Obviously, there's some very disturbing things which you talk about, and in my epilogue, I talk about them. I talk about some of the challenges we face today, which have led me to downgrade our democratic credentials. But I think, it's important. The thing that is important, obviously, intellectuals must do rigorous research, must work hard, must be independent-minded, and must never attach themselves to a political party or politician. They have ideas and philosophies and ideologies. And I think the situation is, you're right, that this is, as I've said in the past, the most anti-intellectual government India has had. But there may be governments to follow. Let's hope for that. Thanks.
Hi, thank you for your talk. So my question was in relation to the Indian state and press freedom, as to how India has dealt with the press post 47 till now. This is obviously in context of the IT surveys that took place at the BBC offices in Delhi and Mumbai. So how do you think how the Indian state has dealt with press freedom from till 47? Obviously, we had the emergency period and post 2014, what we had experiencing with this government. How do you think that has panned out?
No, so that's a very good question. Answer it not. So all governments are suspicious of excessive press freedom, including the Congress governments of the past. But if I was to look at the history of the Indian press since 1947, I divided into 4 phases. 47 to 64, moderately free, but perhaps too deferential towards the ruling party and the Prime Minister. Not blindly deferential, not a Gandhi media, but maybe a little too respectful because of the aura around Nehru and what he had meant to the freedom struggle. Then you have 64 to 75 is slightly freer. 74 to 77 is the emergency, when the press is crushed. 77 to 2014 is the best period for the Indian press. That's when investigative reporting starts. That's when people go out the countryside to talk about how real people are living. That's when you have the flourishing of the regional language press, because you have the offset. You have education booming, so people becoming literate in all the languages. You have the offset press. Inadu or a Malayalam Manorama or a Amritsar Bazaar Patrika can have 15 or 20 editions. And you can have district news, not just Calcutta news, but Burdwan news, and so on. Right. And there's a very good book on that period by Robin Jeffrey called India's Newspaper Revolution. And now we are in the fourth phase, which is a systematic and ruthless attack on the press. And large sections of the press have been spineless. Absolutely spineless. And of course, if you look compared today with the emergency, there are very interesting and striking parallels. And, I write very large books. I'm also on Twitter. I don't think I'm great on Twitter because I'm not good at epigrams. I need space to write. But one of the epigrams I'm proud of, which I've repeated in the new edition of India After Gandhi, when I talk about the parallels between the emergency and now, is I say, I beg your pardon, Narendra Modi is best viewed as Indira Gandhi on steroids. And in the context of the attack of the BJP, in the context of this government's attack on the BJP, it's not accidental that the BJP press spokesman, the unspeakably vulgar Gaurav Bhatia, where he called the BJP the most corrupt organization in the world, etc., added, even Indira Gandhi banned the BJP, as if that is justification. Right. So this is the emergency on steroids when it comes to the press.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You mentioned private papers and letters that you went through, and that got me wondering, what do you think the historiography of the future would look like?
Terrific question, yeah. And as I said, I regret I'm too old to write a 4th edition of India After Gandhi, probably. But I don't regret that I'm too old to start a biography of some guy who died 5 years ago today. Gandhi left this colossal cache of papers. So did, very relevant whom I wrote about before. So did my book, Rebels on the Raj, is based on... Now, particularly for historians and biographers, where would you begin? You could still try interesting ways to circumvent them. I mean, there's a superb biography of Atal Bihari Vajpayee being published later this year. Watch out for it. And this young scholar has brilliantly circumnavigated the lack of access to private papers by looking at other kinds of records in newspapers, in Hindi and in English, and speech records and interviews and so on. It'll be a different kind of challenge. It'll be a really interesting challenge or writing about, particularly for a historian and also for a biographer. And they'll have to be much, but it can be tackled. One of the things a historian of the future would have to be, or the present would have to be, is much more alert to visual sources, not just social media. Obviously, if you're writing a biography of Donald Trump, his Twitter account is the primary source. And whatever else, he's on some other, what's it called, Trump Social or something?
Truth Social.
Huh?
Truth Social.
Okay. That's a primary source. But also you have to look at, his gestures, his clothes, what the crowd is saying, the posters that are released, So, video clips of his, which are now available in plenty, We virtually don't have video clips of, say, Nehru speeches in the crowd, but in Modi speeches you have it. So I think it'll be a very interesting, different kind of challenge. I would not have been up to it, and this is one of the reasons I'm happy to be where I am today. But it'll be a great challenge. And I'll be excited to see how this is tackled. Yeah.
Hi, sir. So as per me, history is all about questioning and cross-questioning through different perspectives. So there are some burning questions inside me that I really want to ask you. That what was the reason India got its independence while there was no Gandhian movement existing in 1947? Was India really a non-violent country? Because just after getting the independence, India is the only country who got independence through non-violence, and just after getting the independence, we started killing each other in riots. Yeah. And how India would have been if we got the independence in 1925 through Bhagat Singh and Azad.
These are questions. Firstly, since you've asked it, although they're not related to my talk today, India, if we had got independence in 1925, we would have not to do about, there were no, Dalits were oppressed brutally. There were no women in public life. The princely states were not integrated. The Indian population was not prepared. And we would have returned to where we were in the 18th century, 120 different states, warring states. That is what a historian's judgment will give you, firstly. Secondly, by 1935, the British had decided to give independence to India because of the popular movement led by Gandhi, which had millions and millions of people. The revolutionaries did not have a mass base. They were brave, they were patriotic, they were idealistic. They wanted to frighten the British out of India. One, they did not have a mass base. Two, they had no clue about how to reform Indian society. Gandhi's greatness was, he was not just fighting the British, he was fighting India. He was fighting the way we treated our women, our low castes, our minorities, our environment. And those 2 decades prepared us for that. Now, the horrors of partition, it's a complicated issue. Read India After Gandhi, you'll realize why that happened. Finally, every country that got its independence violently, through violent revolution against European imperialism, every such country in Asia and Africa is a dictatorship today. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, sir. At the start of this year, I decided to learn more about India. So I picked up Discovery of India, and then, like you said, there was nothing else after that. Then I picked up your book just to understand what, the reason why I wanted to understand India is to get to know how I can contribute to the nation. So as we see today, it looks like a lot of our press freedoms are being eroded, and the nature of the statesmanship of the people in power has been significantly lesser compared to like what it was in the 1950s or even later.
Yeah.
So what you think, in your opinion, could a young person do?
Thank you for the question. You're looking, let's say your search is leading you to ask the right questions. And that's important. I cannot guide. I'm a scholar. I can try and educate you. If you read my books, or you've read Discovery of India, you read other kinds of books. I recently wrote a column when we turned 75 as a nation, where I recommended 50 books, 50 good books on independent India, none by me, and none published by the New India Foundation, of which I was once one of the trustees. So I didn't want any conflict of interest. But 50 first-rate books that will help you to understand the country better. Look at that list, which is on, you'll find it on Scroll. It's under my name, 50 for 75. And then you make up your own mind, based on your own values, your own understanding, your own, what you want to do with your life, contribute to India. I cannot guide you. That's not, a job of a scholar is maybe to illuminate, to educate, but not to preach. Yeah. But you're asking the right questions, and good for you.
Thank you.
Congratulations for your excellent presentation. I'm inspired. I have 3 whys to tell you. Why is it India still remaining as a functioning anarchy?
Okay.
That's a question. Second, 2 simple human beings I met last few years. They asked me some question I want to convey to you as a historian. There's a small village in Sri Lanka called Ravanaguda. When I went to study anthropology, I was wondering, why is Ravanaguda? So I went all the way to that village. The entire village received me. I asked them, why is this place called Ravanaguda? So they explained to me so many stories. But a simple girl, 17-year-old, got up and asked me a question, which I want to tell you. Why are you Indians telling lies to your own children all these years?
Okay.
Her question, okay? Now you can answer it. I have no answer. Second, 3 years ago, 6th of November, I was in Beijing. I landed in Beijing in the morning at 10 o'clock. I was wearing white cotton shirt, brilliant sunshine, but cold. The simple driver in Beijing who came to pick me up from the airport, he asked me, don't you feel cold? I said, no, I'm very happy. He took his bright, warm, red, fluffy coat and put it on me and said, you must wear this. When you are in China, you must be comfortable. Okay. I went. 10 days I was in China.
Can you ask the people waiting? Yeah.
When I had to give it back on 10 days later, he asked me a question. That's what. Why are you Indians becoming conflict culture? He said, conflict culture. Indians and Chinese should never fight. We have the great civilization in the world. We should be peaceful. That's what he told me. So why all this happening? Please answer me.
Thank you, Mr. Maitland. I should tell the young people in this audience that you know about a walk conducted very recently in living memory, not in living memory, in social media memory, from Kanyakumari to Kashmir in a t-shirt. Mr. Menon walked in that dress from Asia to Europe or across the Karakoram, Iran, Afghanistan in 1959. That's the man. Okay. So thank you, Mr. Menon, for coming here. It's always nourishing to see you. I'd say a first question. Why are we still a functioning anarchy? Or as someone said, possibly a malfunctioning or dysfunctioning anarchy. We are a large and complicated and diverse country. I begin my book by arguing we are both an unnatural nation and an unlikely democracy. Never before was a democracy sought to be nourished on such a hierarchical society, replete with caste and gender discrimination, with so much religious and linguistic diversity. And we were always going to be imperfect. The question is how imperfect, There's no 100% democracy. I called India in the first edition of 50-50 democracy. I think we are now closer to 30-70. And I think democracy is a work in progress. In the Indian Republic is a work in progress. And we must always try in different ways, and two of the young people ask questions pointing in that direction, to find ways of reviving our democratic culture and our democratic institutions. But we will always be a kind of moderately functioning democracy. We will never be a perfect society, despite claims made to the contrary by propagandists. The question is, how can we moderate our conflicts? How can we see that they don't go out of hand? How can they see that they don't really disfigure us as a people and as a civilization? We will never lead the world. We should be content within ourselves. Yeah, thank you.
Good afternoon, sir. I was reflecting a bit on that the new edition came out a bit quickly than the older one. So I really want to understand how you think of the rate of change. Although you said as you add more, it's more historically inspired journalism rather than history. And also do you feel that more than politics or culture, the foreign policy and the economic sort of forces, or even the nature of discourse as a force by itself, are there other forces now which are more relevant than it was when you wrote the second edition?
So I'll just very quickly answer that. Do read the book because I explain why the change has been so rapid and why I did it. Briefly, I talk about 4 challenges. One is majoritarianism and the stigmatization of Indian Muslims, which is a major transformation and deeply worrying transformation of the last 5 or 6 years. The second would be the undermining of democratic institutions, which we've talked about. But there are 2 other challenges which well predate Narendra Modi, which had been set in motion probably from the 1960s or 70s, and the Congress government did little to address them, in fact, also helped to intensify them. These 2 additional challenges are the North-South divide, which is now growing, where the more progressive, less patriarchal, more innovative, less conflict-ridden parts of India may have an even more marginal voice in Indian politics if more seats are allocated to the North. And the last challenge is the environmental challenge. The terrific devastation of the natural environment under successive governments, and the Congress and the BJP, and how this imperils our future as an economy, as a civilization, as a society. But I talk about all this in the new edition. Yeah.
Hello, sir. Big fan. So when we are reading about a famous historical figure, should we judge the person through the lens of 2023, like the moral character of the person? So let's say I'm currently reading your book, Gandhi, The Years That Changed the World. Yeah. I had preconceived notion of Gandhi before reading your book, but when I started reading your book, I started to see fault lines in Gandhi's character. For example, Gandhi had problematic views on women. He had problematic views on caste system of the Hindu religion. He had problematic views with his sons. So should we judge him for that, or should we give him the benefit of the doubt that everyone around him at the time was almost similar at that time?
So, with regard to caste and gender, and possibly even his treatment of women, he was a man of his time. Indian fathers were overbearing, unfeeling. Upper caste Hindus didn't always understand the desire for self-respect among lower caste. And of course, he was a patriarch. But the greatness of God, I don't know how far you've reached in my book.
I'm in 1922.
Okay. So you have a long way to go. And you'll find that one of the interesting things about Gandhi is that he's growing. He's imperfect, but he's aware of his imperfections. And experience teaches him to grow and become a more morally conscious and humane person. So read on, and you'll find new things about Gandhi when it comes to caste and his as a father and so religion and so on. Read, keep on reading.
Okay. Thank you. Will do.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Big fan. In the previous edition of your book, there was a line that when British were relinquishing the control, they wanted police protection, but when India attained the freedom, Britishers were the most secure people because we were busy killing each other.
Yeah.
So some critique like J. Sai Deepak and all, they say that in 1947 we got like freedom from colonial Raj, but our mindset was still colonial, and we haven't done a good job of decolonializing our mindset. How do you think the state has done?
No, so these are all fashionable cliches. I think the greatness of, I talked about, I said, in response to an earlier question, that Gandhi was fighting the British, but he was also fighting India. Because he recognized that India had imperfections. And a true patriot is that person who recognizes imperfections in her society, culture, and civilization. India is not destined to be great. India was not always great. India was an ancient and complex civilization with some phenomenal achievements and some deeply disfiguring features to it. And if you look at the people I admire most among modern Indians, Gandhi is only one. If you look at Ambedkar, and you see how his mind and vision of India and the world was transformed by his travels and education and England and America. There's a wonderful new book by an American scholar called Scott Strauss, which is about the impact that the great American philosopher John Dewey had on Ambedkar when he studied in Columbia. If you look at Tagore, and please, everyone here, read Tagore's book on nationalism. So you know the difference between nationalism and xenophobia, or between patriotism and jingoism. Tagore understood that India had a lot to teach the world and a lot to learn from the world, which is why he traveled everywhere, not just west to the east. He went to Java, to Iran, to Latin America. And I think that is the greatness of those who nurtured our republic, that they were open-minded. Again, I've given a long lecture on this, which is online. It's called Patriotism versus Jingoism. And it explains this difference. Where if you think India is perfect, the North Koreans think North Korea is perfect. Right? So there are things we can learn from the West. There are the things the West can learn from us. There are things we can learn from Indonesia. There are things India can learn from us. That is the spirit of giving and taking. That's the spirit of cultural exchange. That's also the spirit of a happy marriage or a relationship. Right? So where these fashionable terms are thrown around, decolonize, I find it, I think it's rather trite. People like that should read Ambedkar and Tagore. I know that a certain detestation of Gandhi and a venomous hatred of Nehru is there among this new breed of historians. I don't want to change that. I can't change that. But let them read Phule, the truly great emancipator of the Dalits, low caste, well before Ambedkar. When Phule wrote Ghulamgiri about caste inequality in 1865, who did he dedicate it to? Abraham Lincoln and the fight against slavery. So that's the spirit we need to embrace. These people are making us a frog in the well. By these people, I mean the Prime Minister downwards. That India is perfect, India is great, India only has to teach the world. Look at yourself in the mirror, for God's sake. Yeah. Last question.
Yeah. Your last answer is actually where my question stems from. When I first read this book in 2008 when I was in college, it seemed like a people's history or a history from below kind of approach, where it was more about the underlying social dynamics of India.
Yeah.
But since then, many of your books and even your answer seems to have a great man theory of history almost, right? Where it's more about personalities. How would, forget today's context, but how would you view the history of India against these two different approaches?
So, it's a very good question. I started actually as a so-called subaltern social historian. If you read my works on peasants and forests in the 80s and 90s, my actual real interest, if you ask me, is not in the Nehrus and the Patels and the Ambedkars, or in, the kind of invisible, hard to document people at the bottom, but the intermediate figures. I think that's sometimes the most interesting, I think. So, but I think you need all. I mean, my book is, India after Gandhi is history from below, it's history from above, When I write about Gandhi, I also write about peasants and women and, the caste system, but it's from the viewpoint of Gandhi's life. So in the course of my career, I've done different kinds of things. I've written subaltern social history. I've written a book right now, which will not be published for many years to come, which is about two remarkable figures who have long fascinated me. It won't be, because I'm still doing my research, it won't be. One is about a pioneering Dalit social reformer in Karnataka, and the other is about a pioneering Muslim social reformer in Maharashtra. Right. So, but it's about the interaction between peasants and those who represent them, a nation, and those who make it from the top and those who make it from below. So I'd say India after Gandhi is probably a mix of all the approaches, because it had to be. After that I've written biographies, that's true. But it's all great men. My last book, Rebels Against the Raj, is about 7 radicals, who struggled, and none of them occupied any kind of political power. I don't think there's many forms of history flourish. Right. For a book like India after Gandhi, I had to use all different perspectives. In the other different books I've written, sometimes it's been history from below, sometimes from the side, sometimes even environmental history, sometimes cricket history. I think that's what I like. I don't want to, do the same kind of thing all the time. And both have their place. I think history is really and I think young people should read all kinds of history. You're right. They should not only read about Nehru and Patel and Bhagat Singh and Bose. They should read about peasants and workers and women and artisans. They should read about technology, which is very important in changing our lives. They should read about the landscape. These are all things that history is composed of many different things. And you're right about the dangers of great man theory of history. The last thing I'd say, they're being called by a home minister to write the true history, an alternative history, a Hindu history. And it's only Hindu great men. He gave a speech recently, said, a challenge to historians, find me 20 Hindus who fought for our freedom. And what's left is Hindu kings who fought against Mughal kings. That's what he wants. Right. So that's about it's a very impoverished view of history, because history is about many things. It's about everyday life, about culture, about ecology, about agriculture, about architecture. And different historians do different things. In my work, I've tried to, there's some things I don't touch. I don't understand technology, I don't write about it. I don't comment about it. Economics I have a very imperfect understanding of, and whatever I write maybe is less flawed. But, I think I would not want either practitioners of history or readers of history to think one kind of history is superior to another kind of history. May all schools first. Thank you. And just to say that I'll be signing books outside. If anyone has any questions, they can come and ask me there.